allegation. It's not a new allegation. It's been made quite a few times before. So what I would like to do is, in the time I've got available, is to look at those three deaths of Rachel, of Tom, and of James. And I think what we will see, and what I would like to do is first look at the circumstances of their deaths, then move in Rafah, then move to the US and look at the problems the Corrie family faced trying to find justice for their daughter's death and seeing how they were blocked in the US. Then I'd like to move across to the Atlantic to the UK and see the problems that the Herndl family faced trying to find truth and justice over their own son's death, Tom. So let me first of all go back to Rafah, to the circumstances you saw there in the documentary. Rachel was the first death. Rachel, a 23-year-old American university student from Washington over on the West Coast. And she was the first one to be killed. You heard the eyewitnesses say that she was deliberately run over and killed by that 60-ton monster of a bulldozer. You saw some of the photographic evidence as well. What do the Israelis have to say? Let me remind you what they said. They said, first of all, she was killed by a falling concrete slab. Now, I don't think you saw any concrete slab in those photographs that you saw. The next version, when confronted by the evidence, was to say that she was killed by a hand grenade thrown by a Palestinian. This is what Rachel's father, Craig Corrie, has had to say after months of listening to the dissembling lies and artifice of the Israelis. He said in Time magazine, the lies they told were the lies of 7-year-olds. They weren't used to being questioned. Let's have a look what happened to Tom. Remind you what happened to Tom there. Tom, that 21-year-old student from London. The eyewitnesses say that he was wearing a bright orange jacket, he was unarmed, and he was killed. He had been in view for quite a few minutes on that Israeli watchtower before he was shot through the head by the sentry in that watchtower. What do the Israelis say? Well, their first version was that he was wearing combat fatigues, he was carrying a pistol, and he fired several shots up at that watchtower. The second version was that he was a human shield for a Palestinian gunman who fired a few shots up at that watchtower. The final version was he was shot in the back of the head by a Palestinian. Anthony Herndl, his father, had this to say about the Israelis and their version of events. He said, they just lied continuously. It was a case of them shooting a civilian and then finding a cover story to match. They weren't used to being challenged. James Miller. You saw the incident there with James Miller. I'll cut this short and very simply say that you saw the two shots that rang out. The Israelis say he was shot in the back by a Palestinian gunman caught in crossfire. Well, the Miller family were very fast off the mark in the UK. They spoke to the UK ambassador in Tel Aviv. They hired themselves an Israeli lawyer, a pathologist, a police photographer, and a ballistics expert. So their pathologist was present at the autopsy. And it came clear that James had been hit from the front by a bullet. The ballistics expert then was able to show that the bullet was an Israeli bullet fired from an Israeli rifle. So armed with that evidence, their lawyer then went to the Israelis and requested the seizure of those rifles of the 15 soldiers who had been on duty around the armoured personnel carrier you heard them talk about. Well, it took 11 weeks. 11 weeks to hand over not 15 rifles, but 9. And what was quite contemptuous about all of this, the 9 rifles they handed over had sequential serial numbers. That meant, for example, 982-157, 982-158, 159, 160, 161. Now, the only way you can get sequential serial numbers on rifles is if they've been issued to soldiers on the same day they've completed their training in the same unit in Israel. So in effect, what they'd done is gone like, you want 9 rifles? Okay, we'll give you 9 rifles. go along to the nearest training depot, grab 9 rifles in a row and hand those over and say, there you are, test those. And quite clearly the ballistic evidence couldn't match the bullet with any one of those 9 rifles. So that was the end of the investigation for James Miller. Game, set and match to Israel on that one. Totally dependent on them doing fair investigations onto the actions of their soldiers when they kill someone. They don't do it. And that's exactly what Craig Corrie and Anthony Herndl had to say as well. There are no investigations worth talking about. There are no statements taken from witnesses other than Israeli soldiers. There are no investigations carried out worth the name. Let's go across now to the US and let's see what happened to Rachel Corrie's family in their search for truth and justice over her death. Remember, one of my claims is that the American and British governments provide material, legal and moral support for the Israelis in the commission of their war crimes. What are they going to do about what happens when one of their own gets killed? Well, the Corries were very fast off the mark as well. Within 9 days of her death, I think it was about the 25th of March, they got their congressional representative in the House of Congress, Brian Baird, to table a resolution, Resolution 111, and nothing happened. He tabled a resolution. There was little response from any of the congressmen, seemed to be apathetic about it. Last year in 2010, when he was no longer a representative in the House of Congress, he hadn't sought re-election in 2010, he said in the public speech that he also believed that Tom Lantos, the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, had blocked it in the committee stage. Tom Lantos was an ardent Israeli supporter. He died a few years after that. The replacement was Lawrence Berman, another ardent, as chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, another ardent Israeli supporter. So we can see several years there, these chairmen blocking it, and apathy in general amongst the representatives in Congress. So in effect, no investigation. So the legislative branch of the American government would not open up an investigation into the death of an American citizen at the hand of a foreign power. It's very strange. The Corries are nothing but persistent. They then spoke to the US Justice Department. It took them 2 years to get a meeting with the US Justice Department. It became quite clear in their meeting why the US Justice Department was unwilling to speak to them. Because after a very short while in the meeting, it became quite clear, the representative made it very clear that no US Attorney General, past or present, would ever open an investigation into Israel. And the Corries were stunned by that. And they turned around and they said, are you telling us, if we provide you with insurmountable evidence that our daughter had been deliberately killed by the Israelis, you would not open an investigation? Yes, that's right. It's the second branch of the US government that would not cooperate into the death of an American citizen. So the Corries, as I said, very persistent. They then filed a lawsuit against Caterpillar, who are the US manufacturers of that 60-ton D9R armored bulldozer. The case went to court in May 2005 and was dismissed on the 22nd of November 2005. On appeal in 2007 and again in 2009, the case was dismissed. There was an insurmountable obstacle here for the Corries. Why? Because the American government had made it clear that they had purchased the bulldozers. They had then donated these bulldozers to Israel. That is to say, this was a foreign policy decision. And as soon as the courts heard that this was a foreign policy decision, it's outside of their jurisdiction. Case dismissed. So there we have the third branch of the American government, the executive branch, blocking an investigation into the death of an American citizen at the hands of a foreign power. let's go across the Atlantic and have a look at the death of Anthony and of Thomas, and the search for his family for justice. Oh, sorry, what I didn't say there at the end there, as I said, CORE is very persistent. They have also filed a lawsuit against the Israeli government. That took 5 years to open. It opened last year. It's still ongoing. The two bulldozer drivers, one's the navigator, one's the driver, both of those gave their own testimony a couple of weeks ago. We expect some conclusion on that case by the end of this year. So back over across the Atlantic to the UK. For the Herndl family, it was the reverse of what happened to the Corries, in that they actually got a conviction. It was after the conviction that they ran into problems with the UK government. Now, Anthony Herndl, Tom's father, is a lawyer, and immediately after Tom's death, he went to Rafah, spent 7 weeks in Rafah collecting evidence. He actually interviewed those eyewitnesses, the Palestinians and the internationals there, those people that the Israelis would not interview. He collected their statements, he collected the photographic evidence, and then went back to England, and in about the June of 2003 handed over a very compelling legal brief to the British government and said, there you are, sort that out. Baroness Simmons, the foreign minister, contacted the Israeli foreign minister, urging them to set up an investigation. Surprisingly, there was one. By the way, I must point out at this stage that the soldier, the Israeli soldier who fired that shot, was a Palestinian Israeli and not a Jewish Israeli. I think that has a lot of significance. So the Israelis opened up their investigation. That led to a trial, and it led to a conviction. The soldier who fired that fatal shot that killed Tom got 8 years for manslaughter. Now, you would have thought the Herndls would have been happy with that. I mean, when you bear in mind that the longest sentence prior to that 8-year conviction for manslaughter was for the death of for death of a Palestinian was 35 days. So this is progress. But the Herndl family didn't feel that. They were still very, very angry for two reasons. They didn't believe Tom, they thought Tom had been murdered. It wasn't a case of manslaughter. And secondly, they thought the soldier who shot him dead, Sergeant Tezir Haib, was also a victim. He was a scapegoat for the system. And what they wanted to do was to pursue the Israelis up their chain of command and get to the officers who had issued those shoot-to-kill orders. Let me just give you some idea of what I mean by this. The Palestinian Israeli soldier, Tezir Haib, in the court case, when he was testifying, couldn't understand why he was being prosecuted for doing something that everybody else in his unit was also doing. And not only also doing, being told they would be protected, why wasn't he being protected? And also being encouraged to shoot at unarmed civilians. And here are quotes from two Israeli officers in the same trial as well. One of them a colonel. He said, in a war zone there are no civilians. I beg your pardon. I mean, Geneva Convention makes it quite clear we have to distinguish between civilians and non-combatants. Another one said, paraphrasing him, that everyone in Rafah is our enemy, including international solidarity movement activists. Now, with that sort of attitude,